when we're using the biblical passages that talk about end time events or prophecy or something like that, and we read about details about, say, one world organizations or centralized governments, centralized religion, or city-state entities like Vatican City or Monaco or what's it over in Asia? I'm drawing a blank now. Singapore. What are the there's 3 city-state locations in the world today. Those 3 that I just mentioned: Vatican City, Monaco, and Singapore. Well, when we look at prophecy and end-time prophecy in particular, it's easy for us to kind of plug in and overlay those big, bad, authoritative Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran entities into the text, because we were looking at large-scale movements of people and of policies and restrictions and things like that. The Antichrist is going to make the entire world take the mark of the beast. Well, this doesn't seem possible to us in a Protestant Reformation model. But if we perhaps say plug in the Catholic model, where there's a lot more structure and kind of compulsion to do things according to from the top down, well, then we Protestant evangelicals begin to say, aha, this seems to make a little bit more sense. So that's kind of why we have these particular say differences, stark contrasts between the historicist perspective that's held by a lot of Catholics versus the futurist perspective that's held by maybe more Protestant evangelicals and things like that. Let's look at the third model real quick. The third of 4 models, the Preterist Interpretation, or it's known as Preterism. This is a Christian eschatological view that interprets some partial preterism or all future preterism. So it's going to be 2 versions that we're looking at here in a moment. So partial and full. So it interprets some or all prophecies of the Bible as events which have already happened. Again, we're going to see these in the bullet points below. So when we talk about already happened, we're looking at events. It's a little bit like the historicist perspective. We're looking at history, but the big difference for the preterist is we're looking at past history versus looking at contemporary or future history or something like that. So that might be kind of the thing that kind of separates all of these views from one another, is where all of us are looking at kind of historical events. Just where are you looking? Are you looking at history in the past, history in the present, or history in the future? Right? That's kind of, if you haven't gleaned that, that's kind of the basics of what's going on with these perspectives. Wikipedia continues, speaking of preterism as a whole, this school of thought interprets the book of Daniel as referring to events that happened from the 7th century BC until the 1st century AD, while seeing the prophecies of the book of Revelation as events that happened in the 1st century AD. So that's kind of a big detail or definition that drives the preterist perspective, particularly as we're going to see, and this next paragraph highlights it. Preterism holds that ancient Israel finds its continuation or fulfillment in the Christian church at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So AD 70 is a big key event for, especially for full preterists, maybe not so much for partial preterists, but for full preterism, AD 70 was kind of like the big defining end of all events, particularly the future destructions of Jerusalem that are outlined in Matthew chapter 24 and certain parts of Revelation and things like that. The full preterists came along and said, well, this was Jesus and foretelling that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed and that Judaism would be coming to an end. Therefore, the Christian church is kind of like the spiritual fulfillment of what we were reading about. When I say fulfillment, I mean picks up where Judaism left off. Almost kind of replacement ideology fashion, replacement theology and things like that. Let's keep reading about preterism. Preterism holds that the contents of Revelation constitute a prophecy of events that were fulfilled in the first century. Preterists believe the dating of the book of Revelation is of vital importance, and listen up, that it was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is a very important factor that you need to be aware of, especially in full preterism. AD 70, with the destruction of the temple and the eventual downfall of Jerusalem during the Bar Kokhba revolts later on in the 130s of that same era, AD, it's important to understand that preterism interprets end-time prophecy as having to have been delivered to the people of Israel before the destruction of the temple. So the date of the book of Revelation ends up being very, very early, like as early as in the 60s, like almost contemporary with Paul's writings, closer to that time period. Paul wrote in the 50s, the mid 50s, before he was imprisoned in Rome in the 60s. So in that sense, the book of Revelation, John being exiled to the Isle of Patmos, was very early, and the book of Revelation was penned very early and began to circulate among the Christian churches, particularly the 7 churches in Rome in Revelation, and therefore it had to be received by them and kind of understood by them so that they could be prepared in advance for the destruction of Jerusalem that was going to happen within a decade. That's kind of where preterism needs to have its foothold. Wikipedia continues, Preterism was first expounded by the Jesuit Louis de Alcazar during the Counter-Reformation. The preterist view served to bolster the Catholic Church's position against attacks by Protestants who were under the historicist view. I'm sorry, not the historicist view, but the futurist view, were identifying the Pope with the Antichrist. So the futurists were saying, well, it's the Pope and Catholicism, they're the ones that are the big baddies. So, the Catholic Church was looking to some support from the preterist view as well, saying, no, it's not us. It's ancient Rome and ancient Judaism and all that. The Catholic Church wasn't even around in 70 AD. So why would it be us that's the ones that are the beast in Revelation and things like that? How can you say that we're the ones that were doing all those bad things or are going to be doing all those bad things, right? Also, keep in mind that the preterism view, when it comes to full preterism, sees basically the books of Daniel and chapters in Matthew and the book of Revelation as basically already completed. It's past history. Does that make sense? So they're not reading it with a view towards that there's going to be something bad coming around the corner in that regard. Let's look at the ways in which partial and full preterism differ from one another real quick as we're drawing to a close so I can read the idealist version. And then I'll probably save next week for the building a case for the perspective that I hold to. So we got partial and full preterism differing in these particular important ways. Wikipedia continues. Partial preterism, which is often referred to as Orthodox preterism or classical preterism, it may hold that most eschatological prophecies, such as the destruction of Jerusalem, the Antichrist, the Great Tribulation, and the advent of the day of the Lord as a quote-unquote judgment coming of Christ, were fulfilled either in AD 70 or during the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Nero. So that's very, very important distinction that they make. In essence, when they're reading through the book of Revelation, like we're going to be doing it for this particular study of mine, they're saying, well, look, it's already fulfilled. And they're using scripture to drive their understanding of it being already fulfilled. And then so they're going to look through history for the confirmation of their understanding of this particular passage of the Bible, Revelation and things like that, and Daniel. By comparison, full preterism differs from partial preterism in that full preterists believe that the destruction of Jerusalem fulfilled all eschatological or end-time events, including the resurrection of the dead and Jesus' second coming or parousia and the final judgment. And so becomes kind of incredible to me how they can hold that view that the resurrection of the dead has already taken place, the second coming of Jesus has already taken place. But that's the view they hold to. And so, what can I say? It is what it is. And then we just kind of have to deal with it. Let's finalize our study tonight and just deal with the idealists. And then I'll leave off next week where we're talking about building a case for a literal hermeneutic. I was going to talk about some, give you kind of a preview of some rapture review tonight, but it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to. I don't want to go too far over. Lastly, in our list of 4 perspectives, there might be more, but these are 4 of the biggies, the general ones where most people's interpretation of end time prophecies are going to find their interpretation or find their location. We've got what's known as the idealist interpretation or idealism, and defined as, in the context of Christian eschatology, idealism, also called the spiritual approach, the allegorical approach, which we already looked at, the non-literal approach, and many other names. This particular approach, when it comes to end-time prophecy, involved an interpretation of the book of Revelation that sees all or most of the imagery of the book as basically symbolic. So it's just see symbols and not much more. Definition goes on to say, idealism is common among Reformed theologians, and it is associated with amillennialism. When we're talking about amillennialism, we're talking about a view of the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth that's not literal, it's symbolic. Because Jesus talked about his kingdom not being of this world when he was being questioned by those authorities, and because we know that the kingdom of God really exists, truly exists within our hearts, well, then the amillennialist doesn't have to look for a literal 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ physically on planet Earth. Instead, since Jesus dwells in our hearts, the amillennialist and the idealist simply says, well, this is simply an idea. What do we do with that figure of 1,000 years? Well, that's just kind of conceptual, like many numbers in the Bible. It doesn't have to be taken literally. It's just kind of a figurative, allegorical, or spiritual or symbolic number to speak of kind of a complete unit or something like that. That's kind of the way they approach that text. This is, by the way, in contrast to those who hold to a literal 1,000 years where Christ is physically reigning from earth in bodily form. This particular version or method of interpretation of end-time events continues. There exists in this method degrees of idealism. The most radical form sees it as entirely symbolic, while a more moderate view may allow for some historical fulfillment of events. So if you ever have a dialogue with someone who's an idealist or is into idealism, you'll find that they're not really interested in what the text is saying literally. For them, it's all about the allegorical, the spiritual, and the symbolic meanings of the details of the text. And so, again, we've looked at pros and cons, the dangers of different views, and for this one, you can kind of already kind of automatically begin to perceive that one of the inherent dangers of this view is that it's deeply personal, right? It's not objective, it's subjective. So it means I think the symbol means this, and you might think that the symbol means that, and the two of us are going to disagree because we have different individual perspectives on any different particular end-time text. Let's finish up our these views tonight. Idealism was common in medieval writers and is still taught by some modern theologians. Wikipedia continues. Different authors have suggested that the beast of Revelation represents various social injustices, such as exploitation of workers, wealth, the elite, commerce, materialism, and imperialism. So again, each method has something to add to the discussion of end-time events and eschatology. And so I'm not trying to throw idealism completely out. Personally, I'm not trying to throw it out. Even if I personally don't find myself interacting with this perspective that often. But when we are looking at texts like the book of Revelation, and we find a lot of symbology there and the apocalyptic genre forces us to examine the symbols and their meanings, well, then we would do well to consider that some of this symbology is indeed, say, pointing to a bigger ideal or concept that may not always be best understood to be contained within one individual or one particular city or country or even religious movement or something like that. Wikipedia continues, various Christian anarchists such as Jacques Ellul have identified the state and political power as the beast. And again, we're talking about a one world governmental system that has influence over politics, over commerce, over buying and selling, of course, and over religion. And so it kind of fits with the idealist perspective to say that maybe this is better viewed as not just a one person, but something a little bigger than one person could juggle. In conclusion, this particular perspective, Christian eschatological idealism is distinct from preterism, futurism, and historicism in that it does not see any of the prophecies, except in some cases, the second coming and final judgment. But it doesn't see any of these prophecies as being fulfilled in a literal, physical, earthly sense in the past, present, or future. Right? Did you catch that? Right? Idealism just kind of says, the Bible contains a lot of concepts that were meant to be interacted with the widest group of people. And so in order to do that, it has to be able to be interpreted in any given time period and any given history. And so if it's only locked into one history, one time period, well, then some people are going to miss out on some of the importance of the text. So let's just look at it from the idealistic perspective. In closing this particular interpretation, it views the interpretation of the eschatological portions of the Bible in a historical or future historical fashion as an erroneous understanding. It looks again at those other views of interpreting the eschatological text as error. Again, owing to the fact that if we restrict the prophecies to certain history or historical events, well, then what happens to the people who either don't live long enough to experience those events, or what happens to the Bible when it comes to events that have already come and gone? Does that mean the Bible is nullified? It's no longer important? In the idealist perspective, all of the Bible becomes relevant for every generation and succeeding generations because it's continually being reinterpreted and reinvented, as it were, by whatever particular individuals need to see the symbolism that's contained in those particular texts. So we'll break off this part, topic 2 about hermeneutics. We'll pick this up again next week with this paragraph entitled Building a Case for a Literal Hermeneutic. It's not very long, but there are 5 parts to it, and I can easily hit that next week. And then we'll also give you kind of a sneak preview on some of the different rapture views. Like, for instance, if I zoom in on this page that's supplied by a particular website, Revelation Mark Hitchcock brand credo courses. In other words, they're the ones who put this little image together. But if you look at this, when we're talking about one of the more controversial topics in the Bible, the rapture, the end time event known as the rapture, well, then we can begin to see that there's this perspective known as pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, and post-trib. We're not going to deal with that tonight. I wish I had more time. But if you're interested in these particular topics, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can be notified when I upload new videos, and or be sure to visit my website at tatesectorah.com and be on the alert for commentaries that are forthcoming on these particular topics. But we'll keep looking at this next week. That'll conclude for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.